also much earlier in development, while the association with major minor and emotion is acquired and much later, and maybe not working university.
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with you.
But where does it come from then?
Where does what come from?
So if the scales develop because of the relationship to the harmonic series, and then why does the association with the major minor and emotions come?
Why aren't they there at the same time? Why aren't they there at birth? I mean, at birth, I mean, this is, you know, yet another nature-nurture question that nobody knows the answer to. Whether the really important stuff, and obviously the ability to communicate by virtue of language is really important. It seems quite plausible that evolution would build in a lot of that. Whether evolution would also want to build in sort of at the same time, at the same level of detail, appreciation music, I don't know, I guess it could, but I think it's common sense really, I think, that music derives from speech, not the other way around. And I think that, yeah, again, not everyone's going to agree with that, I'm sure, but, you know, I can easily imagine evolution building in, not Chomsky's universal grammar, but the wherewithal to do speech, to in early infancy begin to recognize speech sounds that are in your local environment and differentiate them from ones you never heard, etc. I have more trouble thinking that way about music, but, you know, what do I know? It could happen, I guess. It's a nature-nurture question, and I think like all nature-nurture questions, you know, it's kind of for beer and late-night conversation. Others?
What if we take a contrary position, that the origins of music are really not about tone and tonality, but based on rhythm? I'm just wondering if you could look at speech rhythms and draw similar sorts of conclusions.
Well, you know, you or somebody made that point before. I mean, again, I don't mean to diminish any other aspect of music and speech. Prosody, rhythmicity, syncopation, whatever. I think they'll all turn out to be parallel examples of how important it is for us to recognize speech. And whether you want to say that speech, as I've said, maybe unwisely, mainly about tonality, or whether it's mainly about rhythmicity, I mean, I think.
But it tells a very different story about the coevolution of speech, language, and music, right? So part of the argument is that there is a common origin for what we perceive in terms of tonality and what we perceive in speech, and these are traits that co-evolved. But what if this was sort of a byproduct of something else that had to do with the emergence of
I guess that's possible. I mean, again, you know, in evolution, you know, one has Stephen Jay Gould's spandrels, things that are not there for any great purpose, that are the detritus, so to speak, of what was important to evolve. Lots of people like that idea. Lots of people don't like it so well. There are obvious examples. I mean, our appendix is an example of something that has no obvious function, etc. But again, I think that's kind of a dangerous game about what maybe is a trivial side product of something. If it evolved as important as tonality and language, which enables us to, you know, distinguish vowels and understand language, pretty unlikely that it just came as a bit of an afterthought. But, you know, that's a judgment call. Yeah.
So the issue of non-human mammals and how this might relate to your hypothesis came up before. So, and I'm not sure I totally follow this, but could you imagine creating a scale that came from, that's based on the vocal tract of an ape of some kind, let's say? Is that reasonable to start with there? So you're relating our scales to our vocal tract. So could we go, well, let's take a look at the vocal tract of a great ape.
I think so. I mean, it would be pretty depauperate in the sense that they have a short vocal tract. There wouldn't be a whole lot of information there in the way there's rich information about 12 intervals of a chromatic scale in our stuff. But yeah, I think you could.
So then the question is, then you can create a little bit of music, so to speak, a series of notes along the scale presented to an ape, right? Are they going to, would you predict that they're going to react to this? And you compare that with a similar series of notes from a human scale. Are they going to, if this is something, a broad biological principle, do you see you get the broad
But let's take it as enormously important in the ape's recognition of conspecific vocalization from apes.
Exactly.
But you want to call that music? Well, that's another ballgame. But for sure, and I think this is what people like the Zanfar are showing, that, I mean, that's rhesus monkey, but apes fine.
Yeah.
That, of course, they're tremendously involved in auditory social communication. Not anywhere near as rich as we have, but it's meaningful. And he's shown that, different sounds have different social meanings, food, whatever.
Yeah, they may not recognize it as music, but I think you would want to predict that they're going to respond to this because of the fundamental basis of the theory they have.
Absolutely. That's why I say, in a sense, I think music comes after the fact, because these things are so basic. So obviously apes and monkeys don't have music, but they would definitely want to have the ability to glean information from their vocalizations. I mean, they'd be foolish, so to speak, not to. And yes, I mean, I think it's not only a prediction, but probably a fact. I don't know this literature very well, but
It's been done.
Oh, it's been done?
Yeah.
And?
Tamarins. Charles Snowden has done this with tamarin vocalizations, and he takes structural features of the vocalizations and then converts them plays them in with instruments that aren't, so they're not the recordings of the tamarins, but they're structurally the same, and they have repetitive elements. They sound like music, not everybody would want to listen to particularly, but the tamarins respond to it in a predictable way. So threat calls that are then transposed into a music-like element, they respond with arousals that you might expect.
yeah, I mean, I think
but not human music.
Yeah, the problem there is,
exactly
what do you want to call music, and that's again just kind of a semantic debate.
Right.
We have our definition.
Whatever culturally evolved that people tend to think is music. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, music to us means something very different than to a tamarind.
Right. I think that's what Chris is trying to.
That was exactly my question. So I guess it's sort of been done.
Yeah. Probably work with birds too.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. I just was charged with overseeing a paper from someone whom you would know, but should remain nameless, I guess, arguing that there's music in birdsong, human music in birdsong, human musical intervals in birdsong. I think so. I'd be interested to see the reviews of this paper. I thought that was pretty much, maybe I thought that was pretty much discounted based on studies in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You look hard enough, you probably find it.
Your arguments seem to rest on the supposition that language is biological. Why is it biological? Or how?
Because we use it to communicate. I mean, the way all animals do. Whether they're communicating, in the very lowest forms of life by ants leaving chemical trails or whatever. I mean, you could think of a zillion examples. I mean, this is all communication with conspecifics for biological value, and we're using it for sure for that. I mean, the fact that it generates culture, in our case, that knows no, or not much, of an analog in other species, okay, that's fine, but, yeah, I mean, I think it's biologically in the most obvious sense of the value of communication with conspecifics.
I thought you'd say something else, Dale. I thought the obvious thing was that your argument's not really based on language, it's based on speech.
Oh, no,
Right,
you
so-
know,
so
I'm sorry, I sometimes use
No, I mean,
I said at the
because that's the
beginning.
stronger argument, right?
Yeah,
on a
yeah, yeah.
biological
I mean,
basis, is that speech is clearly valid.
Yeah. And I mean, I said at the beginning that it was about vocalization
Yeah.
and that, you know, we're enormously prelingually influenced by whatever cave people were saying without speech. Yeah, so
So
I
vocalizing for communication.
Yeah. So, I mean, an or and ah can be just as meaningful as whatever fancy word you could think of using. Yes?
A lot of your stuff's been based on the chromatic, the 12 tone scales,
Yeah.
but for example, Arabic music usually has about 24 divisions of the octave, even though
Yeah.
they don't use all of them.
That's right.
And it's more about the 3/4 tone rather than the
Yeah,
quarter tone.
so when I said, I think when different scales are used, and that's an example, it's really a finer detail added to the basic chromatic scale. So they're dividing 12 tones into 24 and making use of them. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, the idea of ornamentation is so prevalent in folk music. You know, if you bend the string on your guitar, if you make any kind of embellishment, it's not your standard interval. I mean, you're doing all kinds of weird things to improve the emotional impact, the communicative content, be it sad, happy, whatever, in music. But I think the basis of all that universally is the chromatic scale. And we do just as much embellishments, and you could put that in, I think, terms of Arabic music. I mean, they're doing it in a more formal way.
And they have really strong emotional, like Carnatic music,
Yeah,
they have
yeah,
really
yeah,
strong
yeah,
emotional
yeah, yeah,
connections
yeah,
to each
yeah.
makam. So.
But again, in Carnatic music, I mean, the ragas and the rasas that they come from, the rasas, I guess you know more about this than I do, but the rasas are the, I think, sort of 9 emotional states that are populated by hundreds of ragas rather. Again, I think that's embellishment on the theme rather than anything that's fundamentally different. But again, that's just, you know, what I think. David, one more objection. Yes, you would.
So the main points, it's very nice that you summarized it with main points there. And, you know, there's a long history in music theorizing about the relationship between lots of aspects of music and the harmonic series. And so what's, I think, unique about your perspective here is relating it to speech. So take your second point there, our appreciation of tones is the ecological importance of human vocalization. There'd be lots of theorists that the ecological importance of the harmonic series is in things like scene analysis and so on. The harmonic scale is embedded not just in speech, it's embedded in the harmonic series. The constant musical intervals are closely mimic those intervals in the harmonic series that are, and so on. So the nub of what you're saying really is to say that the harmonic series kinds of ways in which people have made appeals in the past are really sort of wrong-headed, and that the speech is really central to what's going on in your argument. So I guess the question would be, can you imagine a critical experiment then that would pit your speech-related theory against a harmonic theory, for which there's a vast literature and vast speculation over a long period of time?
Well, I think the one point I made was that if you just use a harmonic series, you don't get the chromatic scale.
You do get the chromatic scale over harmonic series, of course. I mean, it depends on how far you go, right? People have been deriving these things for years. Thousands of years, yeah.
You know,
If you tune a series of perfect fifths after about 12 tunings, you end up pretty well back where you were.
that's true. Is that plausible? I mean, what biological foundation does Pythagorean tuning?
Well, they probably claim it's not biology. Probably most theorists would claim it's acoustical. It's just a
Yeah,
physical fact of the world.
that's why I say, I mean, in my view, to the detriment of auditory science, it derived from Helmholtzian physics and has been populated for most of the 20th century by physicists, not physicists, but acousticians who were trained in physics and physical acoustics and thought that that's what it's all about.
Don't
And
get me wrong,
stop with the
I'm not
cooking.
arguing that your speech view is wrong. I just think, there is a long history and an awful lot of literature out there. And it seems to me that the thing to do now is to do the critical experiment or the critical, what is it? Because you're basically predicting a lot of the stuff that comes out of the traditional harmonic theory. And then, what's different? And how would you distinguish that?
You show me the experiment and we'll do it.
Yeah, it was a question.
Yeah, it's a good question. But I guess I disagree with you that the chromatic scale comes readily out of a harmonic series in a way that makes any biological sense.
Well, there'd be thousands of theorists who disagree with that. You can certainly get the diatonic scale.
Yeah, diatonic scale is just a
The
subset.
third harmonic, you divide it by 2, you have a fifth. You take the fifth harmonic, you
Yeah, but
divide
this
it by
is not-
4, you have a musical third.
Yeah, but even if you say that, I mean, what is the biological significance of that? In speech,
I agree.
it's all about
Well,
biology.
one
You get,
could
I
argue-
mean,
one could
demonstrating
argue-
that you've got the chromatic scale in speech puts you in a biological framework, not a physical framework where you're talking about a harmonic series.
Well, one could argue, though, that the physical principles are even more fundamental than the biological principles. So if you look at Francis Crick, for example, on molecules and men, he argued there are really 2 things that distinguish light. One is evolution. The other is non-equilibrium pattern formation. Right? So, to say that everything has to be, have an evolutionary explanation in that way of thinking, I mean, I don't necessarily agree. And I think that, many people would argue that the physics is more fundamental than the biology, the principles of physics.
Yeah, so this brings us back to vision, and maybe we should end here and eat lunch. But in vision, the principle that drives vision and that explains why vision a la Hugo and Wiesel has failed to explain what we actually see is not just the perception has been neglected, that's a starting point, but that the physics of the world is unavailable to the visual system. The physics of the world is unavailable in photons. It's just not possible to get any metric of the real world parameters that we behave in terms of photons. And I would say that it's going to be the same in audition. That physics is going to be beyond the pale of what the auditory system can access. But that's
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a fundamental difference between the visual system and the auditory system, which is that, the frequencies that are available in music are the frequencies at which neurons like to fire. From thousands of hertz in subcortical auditory system to, 1 or a half a hertz.
But again, I mean, that runs out of steam pretty quickly because locking neuronal firing, the auditory nerve, to frequency of occurrence stops at about less than 1,000 hertz. So, we hear speech and music up to 7,000 hertz.
Well, I would argue with your numbers a little bit there, but my point is that there's a fundamental difference between, the way a photon affects or causes neural response and the way a sound causes a neural response.
Well, certainly the frequencies are a difference by many orders of magnitude. So this is an interesting question. I think energy is energy, and the mechanical energy audition is not the same inverse problem that light energy has, or radiation, more properly said, has in vision. But these are really interesting questions. The difference between physics and biology is really a deep issue. I love it.
That sounds like a wonderful harmonic. So we take this opportunity to thank Dale for. So students and everybody, keep in mind that these are very interesting ongoing discussions. They don't have to stop when the talks stop. We will have a discussion, a panel of sorts at the end of the conference, so some of these hot button topics can be revisited at this time. It's lunchtime, and we don't want you to go hungry, but at the same time, we're not providing you any food, John. Go and forage in the woods for lunch. We're back here at 3:30, but try and convene here a little bit before 3. If you have questions about where to go,